Hi everyone, I'm Tara Brown, AIPAC Mid-Atlantic Regional Director. Thank you all for joining us today on the AIPAC app for this important conversation. Last May, Israelis faced an onslaught of more than 4,400 rockets and missiles from terrorists in Gaza. And despite being under attack by a terrorist group sworn to its destruction, Israel was also the target of extreme hostility on news and social media. Seeing this unfold was deeply disturbing for all of us who care about Israel and understand the severity of the threats she faces. I'm joined today by a great friend of AIPAC and a good friend of mine, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who has just released a new book on this very topic. Jonathan is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and is a true expert on all things related to the Middle East. His book is titled Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. Jonathan, it's always great to be with you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and we have a lot to discuss, so I'd like to jump right in.
Let's do it.
Okay, and the first question actually I think will provide some context for this conversation and also for the book, and that's the genesis of this book. Israel has been to war with Hamas for many, many years and has had many, many conflicts, yet you chose to write specifically about this last conflict. Why? Why now?
Sure. So this is the fourth round that we've seen in Gaza since 2009. And each time I think I've been more plugged in. And not because I've been more interested, but because the technology is more readily available. So I had an opportunity during this war to watch it unfold on Israeli TV in real time because of smart TV and smartphone technology, to be able to watch what observers were tweeting about and writing about, watching our own media, and the disconnect between what I saw happening on the ground in the Middle East and what I saw here was jarring. And of course, everybody always talks about how there's media bias or slanted media coverage or whatever the description is. And we've been hearing that for years. And I think I've always taken it in stride. You kind of just write that off as just, hey, this is a saturated conflict in terms of coverage. There are thousands of people that are covering it. But the utter disconnect between reality and what was written here, what was said here, I felt like it needed to be addressed. And so when the war was over, I took a couple of days to catch up on my sleep. And then I wrote the first draft in 8 days.
Wow.
And then I went to Israel and I conducted 10 days worth of meetings, and I came back and edited for another few weeks. But the goal was to produce the first book on the topic, to start to correct some of these false narratives before the rest of the book started to come out, which will be in another few months from now. So hopefully the information from this book will be digested before the debate renews again.
So can you give us an example of some of the disconnect that you were seeing in real time between what was really happening, what you were observing, and what was being reported?
Sure. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, the one that drove me crazy early on was the idea that this real estate dispute in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah was the cause of the conflict. Last I checked, conflicts are caused by rockets and bullets firing. This was a legal conflict that went back for decades. It dealt with basically a dispute between Jewish and Palestinian families, Jews that had once upon a time held the titles to these homes in East Jerusalem. They lost these homes during the 1948 war when Jordan occupied the area. And then after 1967, they began to try to regain their property, their family's property. And there was going to be a decision handed down in and around the time that the conflict broke out. And this was, for whatever reason, the narrative that so many media outlets grabbed onto. And the thing that drove me probably the most crazy was that just a few weeks before that, the Palestinians canceled their elections. Hamas was about to stand in those elections. Hamas was furious that they were no longer being allowed to run. And what they ended up doing was starting a war to try to win the hearts and minds of the Palestinian people while not doing battle at the ballot box, right? So this was their alternative means for trying to gain the upper hand. and it got no coverage.
Yep.
I mean, virtually none. And so that drove me crazy. But, you know, I would say there are even some other moments that I think are worth noting. You may remember I think it was the third day of the conflict, the IDF tweeted that they were putting boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was actually sitting outside taking a breather because I had been working all day. And I'm on Twitter, of course. I see it and I say, okay, I got to go back in, and I turn on Channel 11, which is kind of I guess I would say probably one of the most popular channels in Israel. And there is a reporter who is standing on the Gaza border, and he's looking at his phone, and he's telling the anchor, I cannot confirm this with my contacts in the IDF. I cannot confirm that there are people behind me. It does not look like there is a ground war taking place. So I say, okay, maybe there's somebody else. Turn it to Channel 13. Channel 13, same thing. Guy's scratching his head, saying, I don't know what's going on here, but we're not on the ground. And look, the Wall Street Journal ran it, the Washington Post, the New York Times, AP, Reuters, they all ran this story. They ended up blaming the IDF spokesperson, Jonathan Conricus, for misleading them. They were furious about it. But the point that I think was important for me to take away was they weren't watching Israeli TV. Had they been doing what I was doing, they would have known there's no ground war.
Right.
But they reported it anyway. And I think there was just a lesson in there that if they perhaps relied on some of the local sources, they might report better. And I don't know why they don't. It's an interesting question for me.
In the book, you examine biases related to the history of Gaza, the history of Hamas, and the history of the conflict as we see it today. Can you walk us through how this bias has been normalized in the coverage of the conflict?
Sure. I think, you know, the first thing to point out is the history of Hamas and some of its patrons working assiduously to destroy all prospects of peace in the 1990s and 2000s, right? It was that campaign of suicide bombings and murder that Hamas carried out almost single-handedly in the 1990s and into the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005. It effectively destroyed the Oslo process. And, you know, it was supported by Iran. Iran provided a huge amount of the funding, hundreds of millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars over the years. The weaponry, in fact, some of the weaponry that's still being fired today comes from Iranian know-how, Iranian smuggling. And these were all things that the media just didn't see fit to cover. And so this tracks back for some time now. We're looking, I mean, Hamas was founded in 1987, 1988, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of institutional memory about their track record in causing mayhem in the Middle East. And then I think more broadly, the fact that there are a couple of countries that support this activity and that fund this activity. Iran being the primary patron, but also countries like Turkey and Qatar and even Malaysia, we see support that they provide to a terrorist organization that continually wreaks havoc in the region, and yet we don't see the coverage of that. It's almost as if, you know, within the media, it's the narrative is sort of, well, you know, we know that the Palestinians and Israelis, they don't like each other. They're kind of like Tom and Jerry. They just fight, and that's how we're supposed to understand this conflict. The bottom line is that if you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's gotten smaller over the years, right? You've got the recent peace agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. The conflict is shrinking, and yet we have a few actors that would like to foment that conflict in Gaza. And it happens every few years. Again, gone from the analysis here, and I just felt like it was a huge gaping hole.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that because Iran, the book is about Hamas, but Iran is certainly a main character in the book. So talk to us a little bit more about the role, the extensive role that Iran is playing in Gaza right now with Hamas.
Sure. Look, you know, you go back to the beginning, and Iran was providing training to Hamas. They actually used to bring them to Sudan when Sudan was a state sponsor of terror before it signed peace with Israel. They were providing a lot of weaponry. They were providing training where they would bring commandos to Tehran to train them how to be effective fighters. A lot of money, a lot of ideological support, political support, legitimization on the world stage. Then, during the Second Intifada, we really saw a significant uptick in that military activity. But then after that, it really was interesting for me. You'd start to see tunnels, all right, a very familiar tactic for Hamas. Many of them built with assistance by the Iranians, by the IRGC. The tactic of firing rockets, the Qassam rockets and some of the more sophisticated rockets, many of those have been brought to the Gaza Strip by Iran. And there is an ongoing effort where Israel is trying to disrupt plots all around the world, and Hamas continues to try to circumvent Israeli intelligence and Israeli operations. It's a cat and mouse game, and nobody talks about that either, right? There is this very long established history that really is beyond debate at this point about the involvement of Iran in all of this. And yet, how many articles, how many news reports can you recall during this most recent conflict that focused on how Iran was fomenting the violence?
Right. It's really a shame. It's really a shame, and it speaks volumes to the work that you're doing to highlight the role that Iran is playing. And while Iran is one of the more notable actors, you just mentioned in the previous question that there are some other groups and countries that are funding and sponsoring some of this terrorism. So who are those other groups? You mentioned a few of them, but who are they and what role do they play? How do they interact with Iran?
Sure. I would say probably the second most important actor in all of this is Turkey. Turkey, over the last decade or so, has become a significant player, a proponent of Muslim Brotherhood movements across the Middle East. This was most prominent during the Arab Spring. But Hamas is a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood, and for whatever reason, the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has really decided that this is going to be his cause. And he's done a lot to try to promote Hamas on the world stage. Turkey is actually a headquarters for several dozen senior Hamas members. You may even remember that back in 2014, the last round of conflict between Hamas and Israel, there was that triple homicide. The 3 boys in the West Bank that were kidnapped and killed, that was planned and financed by a guy named Saleh Arouri, who was based in Turkey. And when the war was over, he announced that it was his operation, that it was Hamas that was responsible for this. He did that in Istanbul, in front of 1,000 people in this massive auditorium that included the deputy prime minister of Turkey, and he got a standing ovation. Okay, so just give you a sense, and Turkey is a NATO ally. And this is something that has just gone on now for the last decade. Now, beyond Turkey, you've got Qatar. I like to call Qatar the ATM of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, also very active in the Arab Spring, very active in trying to promote Islamist groups around the world, funders and financiers of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and of course, Hamas. And again, we don't hear much about it because this is actually home to our largest air base in the Middle East. And it's sort of a dirty secret in Washington that this is going on. And then there was the last jurisdiction that I actually drew attention to during the war, and that's Malaysia. There have been a number of assassinations of Hamas figures in Malaysia over the last number of years, people that are involved in high-tech weapon development. And of course, I don't think the Israelis have ever claimed credit for any of this activity. But it seems pretty clear that that's what's going on. At any rate, I noted in the middle of the war that Malaysia may have to account for some of what happened. And I came under attack by a Malaysian troll army, directed by the government of Malaysia. I received tens of thousands of tweets, really like hate messages at me personally during the war. And they were all Malaysian. And it was just a really bizarre thing to see them mobilize in this way, trying to counter what I thought was pretty straightforward reporting and analysis on my Twitter feed.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And we were talking earlier about being Twitter famous. So there you go. So the book is obviously about Hamas, but there are other groups that are active with terror in Gaza. So who are some of these other groups and how do they interact with each other?
Sure. Look, the big one I think to focus on here is Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This is a group that is smaller than Hamas, but it works hand in glove with Hamas. It's also funded by Iran. It's probably actually more directed by Iran than Hamas is. Hamas is heavily, heavily influenced and financed by Iran, but they don't necessarily take direct orders. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And it's also probably worth noting that with Hamas, they have external leadership, they have military leadership, they have quasi-political leadership, and they don't always agree. They arrive at consensus, and it makes it harder sometimes to say, well, this group is sponsored by Iran. It is, but it's sponsored in a slightly different way than Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is almost a wholly owned subsidiary, sort of like the Hezbollah of Palestinian terror groups. But we saw during the war that the two of them were working together. We also saw that there were new variants of rockets that Iran had developed that were being fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so, I think it's a dynamic that we need to continue to watch. And I think the reason why I say that primarily is because Hamas, I don't want to say that it's a state because Gaza lacks a lot of the attributes of a state, but Hamas is sort of the sovereign there, which means they control what happens in their territory. They're responsible for what happens in that territory. So when rockets are being fired, it's Hamas's responsibility. Right. When tunnels are being built under civilian infrastructure, that is Hamas engaging in a practice known as human shields. So when we see PIDGE firing these rockets and working with them, you have to understand that there's an ecosystem. It's driven primarily by Iran, and it's accepted by the Hamas leadership. And I thought, again, that was another story that probably didn't get enough attention, right. Is that everything that happened, from the smaller groups to the larger ones, all of the violence that we saw, it happened in territory that Hamas controlled.
I want to shift to a topic that our viewers are going to be very familiar with, and that is Israel's missile defense system, Iron Dome, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. How did the Iron Dome change the dynamic of the war?
Look, Iron Dome is nothing short of miraculous in the way that it saves lives, in the way that it provides Israeli decision makers with the time and space to weigh their options before they strike back. And when you think about what just happened in May, it's nothing short of astounding that there was a death toll of some 200 people.
Right.
Of course, every death is a tragedy. I'm not trying to downplay the fact that there was death and destruction. There is no good war. But I will say that Iron Dome saved countless lives, and not just Israeli lives. Right? Because when Israel is coming under attack, and you have to understand that when Hamas fires these rockets, the intent is to destroy. The intent is to kill. They're firing them into civilian areas with the hope that it will hit anything. It's really kind of genocidal, and it's a war crime, right?
Yeah.
This is what they're trying to do. And through Iron Dome, Israel was able to neutralize more than 4,000 rockets, and it was able to think calmly. It was not being pushed. Their leadership was not being pushed by the public to go in and turn Gaza into a parking lot.
Right.
And so Iron Dome was really responsible for keeping the war at 11 days, keeping the death count down, keeping the destruction to a minimum, even with the huge amount of ordnance that was fired from both sides. And it's really actually the thing that had me so shocked when we began to see members of Congress calling for a cutoff in Iron Dome support. I mean, the implication there is to say, well, you know what, we would like to see an uglier war next time around, so let's just deprive both sides of this key tool that has kept the conflict on a lower flame. I mean, that was the implication. Let's let more rockets fall into Israel, which will mean that the Israeli public will want to see a response, and there will be mass conflict that results from this. And so I think it was an irresponsible thing to say out loud, let alone to put to a vote in Congress.
So what's the logic there? I mean, this is a life-saving missile defense system, and yet there are, as you just acknowledged, some of these calls to try and block the emergency funding. What's the logic behind that?
I couldn't tell you. I mean, Hamas started this war, that was the aggressor in this war, that fired 4,000 rockets into civilian areas, and Israel was mostly deflecting, right? I mean, I will say that a similarly ridiculous debate, in my view, is the debate about precision-guided munitions, providing those to the Israelis, because that also minimizes the destruction. It minimizes the casualties. When Israel has the ability not to take out an entire house, but to fire within a certain window, to take out one person that they have identified as supporting Hamas terrorist operations, that is much better than the alternative. And to say that you want to deprive Israel of this precision weaponry means you want Israel to be less surgical in the next round. There's also a very strange logic here, which I think we see in every round of these wars, which is, well, the death count is lopsided. And the implication there, of course, is that Israel should probably have more casualties if this is to be a fair fight. Of course, Israel is blessed with remarkable technology and with advanced warfighters, and they're able to cut down on those casualties on both sides.
Thank goodness, yes.
Yeah, and you would think that lawmakers would appreciate that fact and try to encourage it. We're not seeing that right now, and I do have to say it's a very odd time to be observing some of our decision makers on Capitol Hill.
And just I want to keep going with this notion of the cooperation between the United States and Israel and some of the new technology that Israel is using. It wasn't just Iron Dome. We saw anti-tunnel technology being employed by the Israelis. Hamas, over the years, has spent a lot of time and energy and resources into building these huge terror tunnel networks. How did Israel address this in the last war?
So the technology is remarkable. We don't know everything about it yet. It's sort of, when I ask about it, it's, you know, kind of the old joke, if I told you, I'd have to kill you.
I bet you hear that a lot.
Yeah, I do. But, you know, what we can say is that the barrier around the Gaza Strip is incredibly high tech. There are elements that you can't see that are below the ground. And there are elements above ground. We don't have all the insight into it, but they are able to identify when tunnels are being built. They have sensors, they have intelligence networks, and the Israelis had incredible intelligence for this most recent round of conflict. Some of it may have been human intelligence. I think there's a high likelihood of that, but then there's also the technological components of this, which I think could probably be very helpful for, you know, for our efforts to secure our southern border, for example, and perhaps maybe in other hot war zones where American warfighters are deployed. But when the Israelis began to understand that there was a massive tunnel threat coming, this is the so-called metro system, it became very clear that they had prepared well in advance for Hamas's deployment into this labyrinth of tunnels. And what they did actually was really smart. They destroyed what they could that would not hurt civilian infrastructure. So they attacked the parts of the tunnels that were underneath roads that had been cleared well in advance. But they're not attacking the parts of the tunnels that are under apartment buildings or hospitals, because that's human shields type stuff that would only be a disaster for everybody. So they were very well prepared for that. They destroyed, as we understand it, hundreds of kilometers of these tunnels, but remarkably, there are still hundreds of kilometers that remain.
Yes, it's very scary. It's terrifying. You mentioned earlier the Abraham Accords, and it was really just over a year now that we witnessed this historic signing of the Abraham Accords. What's the role that they played in the latest conflict? I think you and I have talked about this, that it seems like the condemnation of Israel from the Arab world was much less than we traditionally see. Is that real?
It was real. It was more muted this time around. I think, if anything, the Abraham Accords countries in particular, and actually maybe to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, wanted this to be over quickly. They really did. They wanted to just be able to get back to normal. There were undeniably moments of tension. I think it is still very hard for the Arab world to watch TV, as I did. I watched what they watched on Al Arabiya during the war, and you could see that there was destruction that was taking place in the Gaza Strip, and that still has a visceral kind of feeling that is invoked among the Arab populations. But I think they also understood that Iran was behind it, that Hamas, a Muslim Brotherhood splinter jihadist group, was behind it, and they didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for these actors. And so I think that the Abraham Accords were put to a test during this most recent round of conflict, and they came out okay on the other side. You see now a determination to get back to normal. I think it's interesting, though, in the conversations that I've had, you still see a reticence on the part of these Arab countries. They're not ready yet to cooperate with the IDF, right? They will cooperate on everything else, on intelligence, on agriculture, on food, on medicine, life sciences, et cetera. That's all great. The IDF is still off limits, and I think it probably will be for some time. But who knows? Maybe sometime in the future.
Maybe one can hope.
Yeah.
Speaking of Arab countries, Egypt. We often forget that Egypt is actually on the border of Hamas, just like Israel is. So what role is Egypt playing today in Gaza?
So that was another story that wasn't covered well. Egypt, from even before the outbreak of this conflict, was letting everybody know that one was coming, and that they had a role to play, and that they were going to try to keep their border calm, that they didn't want to see another conflagration, they wanted to minimize conflict, et cetera. They were, as I understood it, largely ignored by the U.S. administration. Admittedly, the White House has quite a number of things on its plate and maybe just wasn't quite prepared for what was going to happen. But during the conflict itself, Egypt played the primary diplomatic role, shuttling back and forth between Hamas figures and Israeli figures, talking to dozens of countries and leaders of countries around the world. And ultimately, it was Egypt that was able to secure the ceasefire, almost single-handedly. But I think in retrospect, it looked like the Egyptians gave the United States this victory, this ceasefire, as a means of getting out of the doghouse that Egypt had been in. Because you remember, this administration, when it started, did not have warm and fuzzy feelings about the Egyptians. It still is a somewhat anti-democratic country. Mm-hmm. They have concerns about human rights. So the administration was pretty cool to the Egyptians. I think that changed when the Egyptians were able to secure the ceasefire and then hand it over as a gift to the United States. Now, the big question is, will that hold, right? There's debate, again, about withholding assistance from the Egyptians, and I think it's a mistake. I think they have a role to play. Yes, they have a lot of work to do in the realm of human rights, and I'd like to see more reform. But I think they've proven that they have a very positive role to play regionally in upholding American interests and trying to maintain calm. And I think that was just not well covered during the war.
Agreed. And since you mentioned, that there is still the ceasefire, what is the prospect for this holding? What does the next couple of months and years look like?
Look, we never know when the next conflict's going to break out. It's going to be primarily up to Hamas. It's not usually up to Israel. The only reason why Israel might attack first is if they see what Israelis euphemistically describe as game-changing weapons that they think will put more or a disproportionate number of Israelis at risk, and that they might try to preempt. But that's not a normal thing in this conflict. Usually it's about Hamas deciding that they're not getting enough money by way of the Qataris, that they're not getting enough that comes in through the Kerem Shalom crossing, that there's not enough humanitarian assistance or building materials or what have you. Usually it stems from those sorts of debates, or the political dynamic that I talked about, where Hamas is looking to demonstrate to the Palestinian people that they are the true leaders. And it's impossible to know when it will break out. What I can tell you is that in my conversations with some senior Israeli officials over the last several months, is they said that this does not feel like a secure ceasefire. Mm-hmm. It feels like it's still on a knife's edge. And so, we're watching. The hope, anyway, is that we find an equilibrium between Hamas and Israel. My real concern, honestly, is that Qatar seems to be the glue that's holding it all together, mm-hmm. that they're the ones who are providing financial assistance and trying to sort of placate Hamas and keep them, in check. And I don't believe that the Qataris have the regional interests in mind. I think they still have designs to promote Hamas as the leading faction among the Palestinians. They have zero concerns about their violent tendencies. I would like to see Qatar out of the equation. I'd like to see, getting back to the question of the Abraham Accords, I'd like to see the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Saudis play a more active role, but it's a thankless job. There aren't too many people who want to get involved in Gaza. It's a tough place to operate.
So you conclude the book with a number of takeaways that are meant to inform our elected officials, policymakers who are trying to navigate the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those key takeaways? What are the top takeaways that you want policymakers to walk away with? And then can you also tell the audience who's listening in what their key takeaway is? Sure.
Look, I would say probably two takeaways that I'll mention here. One is that I was talking to Eliezer Toledano, who's the head of the Southern Command. He's the man who basically led the war. I talked to him after the conflict, and I asked him kind of what his view of Gaza was. And he said, it's a lost district. It's no longer part of the Palestinian Authority. It's not part of Egypt. It's not part of Jordan. It's not part of Israel. It is a place that nobody wants, right? I'm not even sure Hamas wants it, right, if we're going to be honest, right? And so there has to be an understanding, I think, here in Washington that as much as we'd like to solve this problem, it is not easily solved, right? I mean, another official I talked to called it the problem from hell. Because it really is. You've got terrorist groups operating there. You've got Israeli distrust. You've got an organization that killed the peace process that the Israelis don't want to work with. And by the way, the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to work with it because they've been at war with them since 2007. The Egyptians don't trust them. The Jordanians don't like. I mean, there are very few actors out there that want to engage in Gaza in the first place. And those that do, Iran, Turkey, Qatar, I don't think they have the best interest of the region at heart, so it is complicated. And so the idea that we should just somehow blame Israel, saddle them with all of this, and wash our hands of it is not realistic, and it's also not productive. I think that's an important thing to remember for those members of Congress and others that were criticizing Israel during this for being aggressive or for being, using disproportionate force, these are sort of silly things to say when you're responding to an aggressor in the first place. So I think that's one key lesson. The other one is this. I think when we look at where America is right now in terms of its foreign policy and how it views itself in the world, we are retreating. It's not something that I take pride in, but I think it's a fact. We see ourselves leaving Afghanistan, leaving other conflict zones, wanting to get out of what people have termed endless wars, and it's isolationism at its core. If we're going to continue to go down that road, and I don't recommend it, but if we do, we are going to need trusted allies, those that embrace the ideals and the ethics and the ethos of America, to try to keep a lid on some of the regions where we have our greatest interests. And if we're going to leave the Middle East, the idea here is not to deprive Israel of Iron Dome, or to deprive Israel of PGMs, or to zero out its assistance. The idea here is to empower this country that is willing to uphold American interest and work with the United States to try to shape the region when the United States is not willing to. And I think that was lost. It continues to be lost. Israel is ready to fight on behalf of the United States and on behalf of itself. It doesn't want America putting boots on the ground in its conflicts. It's ready to defend itself by itself. That is an important attribute for an ally. And I think it's just not, I don't think it was appreciated. Not during the war, not after, certainly not today. Now, as far as the lessons learned for folks at home, I think a couple things. One is, don't stop being active in terms of engaging with elected officials and letting them hear what is happening on the ground, what's being said that is incorrect in the media, what's being said that's incorrect on the floor of the House. These are all things that, I don't think you can give up these fights. It's important to make sure that truth doesn't get swept under the rug. But the other part of it is, and this has been, this is my third book on the Palestinians, and it still is remarkable to me that those that advocate for the U.S.-Israel relationship, they often know everything about Israel, right? They know 48 and 56, 67, 73, all the conflicts leading up to this. They know what the IDF does, what it doesn't do, how it's responsible during the war, what our alliance looks like, how minorities are included in Israel, how it's not apartheid, and that's a ridiculous word to use. But what they don't know is the history of the other side. And they can't speak about Hamas's almost single-handed destruction of the peace process. They don't know about all of the money and training and effort that went into Hamas from Iran. They don't know about the role of Qatar, not in the kind of detail that you need to know in order to contest some of what you're hearing. And so really it's about learning what's happening on the other side of this conflict. It will give you the tools, I think, that you need in order to shape this debate in a way that I think really was lacking the last time around.
Jonathan, as always, great advice, great discussion, super informative. Thanks so much for everything that you do, and thanks for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, our pleasure. And to everybody watching at home through the app, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for all that you do for the U.S.-Israel relationship. And we very much look forward to having you join us for more conversations like this through the AIPAC app. Thank you.